Good evening and welcome to the Climate Justice Panel. My name is Gillian Ferguson. I'm a Marine Affairs major and I'm just going to be moderating the discussion that will come later this evening with this event. So how this is going to work is each panelist, we have 4 here today, are going to talk for around 5 minutes each. And then afterwards, we're going to go into a discussion. And that's when you guys are going to come in with questions, comments, and all that. So if you have any of those while the event's going on, just write those down, keep them in your mind for later. So sadly, we originally had Bridget Haar on this panel, but she could not make it tonight. But I'll be introducing the rest of the panelists. So first off, we have Emma Jones, a marine science major here at UNE. Then we have Dr. Kenneth Courtney, assistant teaching professor of political science at UNE. Then we have Dr. Robert Allegre, associate history professor at UNE. And then lastly, joining us on Zoom, we have Dr. Darren Ranco, the chair of Native American programs and associate professor of anthropology at the University of Maine. I'm really excited to have all these panelists here tonight. And we're going to be starting off with Emma. So, here you go.
All right, hi. My name is Emma Jones. I'm an oceanography major with 2 minors in applied mathematics and climate change studies, and I'll be graduating in May for the school. When I was asked to participate in this event, I had to figure out a way that married my areas of expertise relating to marine science and oceanography and climate injustice, which is the topic of this panel. And I thought that the best way to start would be to talk about climate injustice, since that is at the root of climate injustice. Climate injustice refers to the uneven distribution of effects of climate change and how some people and places may be more vulnerable to those effects than others. I immediately thought of climate injustice in coastal communities, as that is kind of what I have been studying these past 4 years. This is an issue felt around the world due to sea level rise, warming oceans, which damage coastal ecosystems, and increasing storm frequency and intensity. But some communities have less protection and resources to adapt to these damaging conditions. In the United States, 1 in 3 Americans live in a coastal setting, which is a little under 100 million people. Several major cities like Miami and New York are projected to be underwater in 2100, which is following business as usual scenarios. Obviously, they won't be completely underwater, but the cities as we know them today will cease to exist with projected 12 to 18 feet level rises. But some of the communities in these cities are already more vulnerable to these effects. Residents from low-income communities are often not included in the decision-making bodies that govern policy for the residential areas. And even if early warning systems existed in these communities for events like mass floodings, most of these people do not have the privilege to move before or when these events occur. Large flooding events can cause residents to be removed from their homes, which deem them the term climate migrants. The increase of climate migrants causes an increase in immigration and urbanization. And even though it's already occurring today, if business as usual trends continue, the US could see up to 30 climate migrants by 2050. Another area to look at disparities in this topic is just by simply addressing the lack of diversity in coastal education. The average cost for a marine biology bachelor's degree is about $36,000 out of state at private universities. Only about 90 of the around 5,300 4-year undergraduate colleges offer a degree in marine science or related fields, and they're kind of limited to obviously around bodies of water. Also, Black Americans and minority groups only make up about 2.5% of the jobs in marine science fields in the related areas. Coastal communities rely on these ecosystems for housing, food, culture, and tourism, and all of these are at risk due to climate change. So how do we change the business as usual mindset with climate injustice in coastal areas and start methods of adaptation for preparing for climate change effects? Two strategies that I want to touch on that would be most effective are education and inclusion. Public schools in coastal cities should try to teach more about the effects of climate change in the areas that they reside in. Secondary education should be more accessible for lower income students that could not normally afford a college education. Residents should be well represented in the governing bodies that make decisions for their communities. And marine academic circles are filled with unpaid internships that cannot be filled by people that can afford to spend hours of unpaid work during the week. We have a significant amount of systemic work to do as a society to address and fix these disparities affecting vulnerable coastal communities. But frameworks to improve education and inclusion is a step in the right direction. Thank you.
Next is Dr. Kenneth Courtney.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here. Those of you who had a class with me know that my usual MO is lots of caveats, but not in 5 minutes. So here goes. So I'm a political theorist by training. I'm going to humbly throw out a couple of suggestions of political theoretical conceptions for thinking about climate change, where we are and what we might try that hasn't been sufficiently tried yet. So a couple problems with political representation, my area of specialty. Big ones that you are all familiar with, right? One, political representation doesn't really get anything done. Ironically, political representation is supposed to be the structure through which voices are heard and actionable items are brought to bear, and yet very often political representation or the structures of political representation are best known for what they do not accomplish. You can fact check this by reflecting on a couple monumental occasions on which great sort of acts of political representation have made changes. And this will, I think, remind you that the exception proves the rule. That is their rareness that makes them historical and sort of notable. This is a problem if you want dramatic, significant change to respond to climate change and other sort of dramatic, significant conditions evolving around you. So that's the first problem that I'm going to briefly touch on. The second one, you know even better. More ironic still, political representation for a very long time in many different places has not been very representative. That is, it has its exclusionary mechanisms built right into it. And these two things bear on one another in a couple important ways. So I'm going to throw out a couple names. Most of you know probably both of them. One's a little bit more sort of popular speak than the other, but people know who Stacey Abrams is. She's the governor representative of, sorry, she's running for governor of Georgia. She was a previous House representative of Georgia. She is the fair fight voter equality sort of advocate for our current moment, or one of the leading representatives of that dimension. And then I'm not going to say anything about Greta Thunberg because everybody here knows who that is. What I am going to observe is that those two names are very rarely spoken of in the same venue. They're thought of as totally different sort of processes with different sort of domains of concern. My suggestion is this is actually misleading and problematic. So let me just say a tiny bit more about the two problems. We're not exactly sure, us political theorists, why political representative structures are so inefficient, but there's been some thoughts about this. Perhaps it's intentional, right? So one analysis of some of the founding documents of this country is we didn't want any one faction to get too powerful and be able to sort of lord it over and dominate the others. And therefore you actually create conditions where there's a sort of conservative bias built into the system. You don't want dramatic change. Whether that's actually a true description of our sort of political dynamics or not, it's clearly something we're going to have to override if we want to rise to the occasion that we're facing. With respect to unequal representation, well, there are so many different places to begin, but I'm just going to choose a sort of quick meditation upon the word empire. As some of you know, this is a word I throw around in class a bit. I'm going to encourage us to think of empire not as just the British Raj in India, sort of archetypal or paradigmatic example, but to think of westward expansion in the United States as also paradigmatic of empire, right? If you think of it in that way, prior to 1898, that's prior to when we started collecting off overseas possessions, the Philippines and Guam and Hawaii and Puerto Rico and the others, I think you will see the synergy between these. You'll be able to connect voter suppression problems that are happening in 2022 with our imperial history as practiced both on land and off land. If you put all of those things together, the inducement would be to say Greta Thunberg's sort of representative structure and all of those who are supporting her should pay much more attention and be much more eagerly supporting voter rights, working to combat voter suppression and so forth, and vice versa. So all the young energy going to issues of inequity for minority populations and disenfranchised persons would also feel empowered to connect to the climate movement, who after all are representing the people that are disproportionately affected by the harms of climate. That is all I will say. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Emma. Emma, right? And are you a marine bio major? Is that it? Oceanography. Very good. I'm wearing a mask. I have a cold, and so I don't want to get my cold on the microphone. This is really wonderful because we are exploring some different disciplines, all of which under the rubric of climate justice. And so it makes sense that oceanography would be in it, but who would think of political theory? And yet you did such a great job kind of combining and showing us how that works. And the ending of your talk, and it goes right into what I'm going to talk about, and that is people and the history of people and how that intersects with the history of the climate, with the history of the environment. I think, and this is going to work very well with our next guest, who's an anthropologist, right? How is it, and that's something that the Reverend also talked about, how do we address this issue of the populations that are most deeply affected and are basically, in some cases, used as almost like surplus humans, all right, surplus humans. And this has to deal with our history. And so I encourage you to take history classes. This is a part of a PR campaign of mine to go around and get people to take history classes. But if you take history classes and you take, let's say, the history of capitalism or the history of industrialization, the history of industrialization is the history of climate change, because that's where, with industrialization, is where climate takes off and where humans start intervening into the environment and start changing the environment drastically, unlike any other species has in the history of the world, right? And so it begins with the introduction of a new economic system that is for the extraction, that basically is, to produce surplus in the name of profits. Now, empire, that's what it does, right? It's part of a political process tied to an economic system, specifically to extract profits for a certain segment of the population. In our own country, you mentioned the United States, I'm a Latin American. So my talk is about the Amazon, right? Which is something that is obviously, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and all anybody talked about was the Amazon. And by now I would have thought that we would have actually had a very robust, wonderful Amazon that was, protected and that we all respected. In the Amazon, if we're going to talk about people, right, and the colonization of people and how humans become surplus. Right now in the Amazon, we have over 2.7 million people who identify as indigenous of some sort, from over 50 ethnic groups, for over 450 ethnic groups, pardon me. That's the Amazon. It resides in 8 different nation states, so countries, and one territory, French Guiana. Right? But 60% of the Amazon resides under the nation state of Brazil. Right. So when we talk about the history and about the indigenous people, you cannot talk about indigenous people anywhere in the Americas without talking about colonization, right? Obviously. And in the Americas, the indigenous people were colonized by many different European groups. In Spanish-speaking areas, obviously Spain, in Haiti, the French, right? In British Guiana, the British, Barbados, the British, et cetera, et cetera. In Brazil, it was the Portuguese, right? But what all of these groups had in common was the idea that it was a 19th century, maybe 18th century idea that viewed nature as infinite, right? As infinite almost, and as being used primarily for the benefit of people, for humans, excuse me, right? And so as they went into this territory, they viewed the territory as pristine and almost, uninhabited. And that is always one of the first foundational myths of empire and of colonization of indigenous people, is to is to turn that space into a space that is pure, that is uninhabited, that just needs to be discovered, right? You see that in the American West, you see it in Brazil, et cetera. And so these people, or these Portuguese, in fact, for many, many years, the Portuguese did not encroach much into the Amazon just because it was very difficult to get there. And it was the eastern part of the country that was colonized for the production of various commodities, all using African enslaved people. The indigenous were not, as in the Amazon at least, were not colonized in the way they were in Mexico or in Peru, where it was a very brutal confrontation, long lasting, et cetera. Because why? In Brazil, the indigenous groups were more dispersed. They did not have the Aztecs. They did not have the Inca, where you can very much easily go in and conquer, right? And so it took a longer process, but the process that begins in the colonial era, and it's explicitly tied to the system that we call capitalism, because as Brazil was producing sugar and coffee and various other things, Europe was industrializing, right? So the very raw materials that went into the Industrial Revolution in Europe and the United States, for that matter, and elsewhere, was facilitated by the extraction of raw materials in the Americas and elsewhere. In the Amazon, it begins with that, with the extract. And so this is what some social scientists are calling a colonial logic, which I think is what you're also getting to, is this logic of settling, taking land, displacing people, right? And then using that which is in that land, extracting almost always raw materials, and then trading it locally and on the international market. So you're feeding a local nascent capitalism, and you're feeding a growing international economic order based on this types of exchange. And so the indigenous people are not at all remote, even from the, I guess what I'm trying to say is that from the beginning of colonization in Brazil, 6th, 17th century, in earnest, right? You see the indigenous people are not an isolated people. And that's something that we need to really, reject the idea that they are isolated people. They become linked into these broader global systems, economic systems. And it takes place through violence. And so the idea of violence is a very important idea to all of this, in that there is a great deal of coercion. There is a great deal of, of planned coercion, right? Of land being expropriated. That is the colonial logic that comes in from the very beginning. Now this is where it becomes important as a historian to differentiate between the colonial period and the post-colonial. We see a lot in people just talking about history as if, there's no difference between, say, enslavement in the 17th century and enslavement in the 19th century. As a historian, we always break things down. So there is this colonial logic, but it changes over time as to what actually happens. It's actually in the modern period when Brazil is, no longer colonized by Portugal, that you have the Amazon rubber boom, which everyone who knows about Amazon, there's a rubber boom that basically, the Amazon in the late 19th century starts being used very explicitly for economic development. And the idea, again, similarly to the one at the very beginning with colonization, was that nature is there for the benefit of humans, right? And nature is a commodity. That is a very important point, right? The Amazon is viewed as a place where commodities can be extracted. Those commodities, obviously rubber, but from the very beginning, those commodities are indigenous people. So we should look at as indigenous people, as humans, as people who were commodified from the beginning of the colonial era. And that commodification of the indigenous person or the enslaved person where we have slavery goes hand in hand with the commodification of nature, right? And just like you are trading enslaved indigenous people, by the way, there were enslaved indigenous people in Brazil early, you are also exchanging goods, right? You're exchanging goods. It's a very similar logic. And for both that person who is purchasing an indigenous slave or just enslaving them, period, the logic is of basically making money. Obviously, what is the cheapest labor? The cheapest labor is free labor, right? And so you're using free or coerced labor, and then you're taking things from the land, again, that you did not produce. And so there is a great deal of profits to be made in all that. I don't want to talk too much. Alan was saying with this, if you know anything about Brazil now, you know that the president of Brazil, President Bolsonaro, has said some extremely, stuff that is beyond the pale about indigenous people. That, I don't even want to quote some of the stuff, but basically the gist is that they are an obstacle, right? They're an obstacle to a productive, a prosperous, a modern Brazil. And that language comes right out of the 19th century. The idea that the indigenous people are obstacles to development. You think about Standing Rock, right, which is in North America, right? The whole point, not the whole point, but one of the big arguments is, against the indigenous or for the pipeline is that it's good for, it's necessary, right? It's necessary economically, and that the indigenous people are holding back this economic development plan, so to speak. So anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Lastly, we're going to just hand it off to Darren Ranco on Zoom.
Really happy to be joining you all. I wish I could be there, of course. I had to teach until 5 up here, so couldn't quite make it down. I'm going to present some original research that we've been doing up here in collaboration with, first and foremost, the Passamaquoddy tribe at Sabayak, but also sort of more broadly with all the tribes here in Maine. And in just a short amount of time, I want to, it's research that is meant to be applied for Wabanaki leadership for climate adaptation across our region. And I'll say more about that, but the two major points I want to get across to you all is Wabanaki people and place is formulated around a hundreds of years old form of diplomacy where we have come together repeatedly in these last several centuries to address and solve problems that impact us all as Wabanaki people. So I want to talk a little bit about that and sort of the place for that, because I think that's the work that we're mobilizing for climate adaptation. And I want to get into a little bit of the findings of the research, which a fair amount, and I'd say the majority of the data collected was by my graduate student and now my postdoc, Natalie Michelle, who's also an Indigenous scholar, where we're furthering this work to develop Indigenous-led adaptation plan. So the Passamaquoddy tribe at Sabayak, Pleasant Point, had a grant in 2015 related to establishing a climate adaptation baseline for all the tribal nations here in what is now Maine. And the idea is to build community-based, salient, culturally relevant climate adaptation plans and address climate impacts of Wabanaki health, such as increased pathogens, destruction of tribal infrastructure, loss of habitat, subsistence resources caused by basically climatic change. And it builds upon ongoing work that the tribes have been engaging in since before 2012, but in 2012, FEMA, for the very first time, did some baseline emergency response planning with the tribes related to climate change. Our research methods mobilize Indigenous research methods, which share a lot with community-based participatory research, sustainability science, recognizing the need for multiple forms of knowing and really emphasizing Indigenous frameworks for knowledge and knowledge production, and really centering sort of the questions by Indigenous people, not the questions by sort of outside entities. It also understands the key to climate adaptation in this context as based in community, social, and cultural resilience. So the answers for Indigenous peoples, as well as other quote unquote at-risk climate impacted peoples, is not to become just like, suburban business people, but to really resort to our culture and use our frameworks of understanding and adaptation to environmental change that have existed for thousands of years. So again, these sort of cultural frames around Wabanaki diplomacy as first a place and then a process has been core to our research. Just a quick reminder, I'm sure everyone knows where the tribes are in our state, but just the 4 nations, the 5 reservations, the 2 Passamaquoddies over in Washington County, Penobscot, Holton, Band of Maliseets, and I need to change this. The Aroostook Band of Micmacs changed their name to Micmac Nation to about 2 months ago. So one of the things I would just, going from that map, which is a recreation on the right here, to the map on the left, there's actually, when we wrote about it in this grant with the Passamaquoddies wrote about it in this grant, it's sort of all of the lands controlled by Wabanaki people, which in the map on the left is sort of, those are the locations, and it exists in a kind of checkerboard of trust and fee and reservation lands by the 4 tribal nations. But it's just to give you a sense that you know, a lot of them for Penobscot are in our watershed, Penobscot watershed, but we also have lands in Western Maine, as do the Passamaquoddies, that were regained after the land claim settlement in 1980. But really, when we think about Wabanaki as a place, Wabanaki in the language, that this greater Wabanaki territory exists across national borders. And, you know, when we come together as Wabanaki nations, we are meant and in the service to our human and non-human relations in this broad territory. And that is very much a critical part of this work that our Canadian relations have been an important party to our framing of sort of the adaptation, not only sort of the baseline of like what are the impacts, but also the baseline regarding to what kinds of adaptation priorities we will engage in. So you can see that across the border, there are 29 Micmac, 1 Passamaquoddy, 2 Wabanaki, and 6 Maliseet bands. So as a process, the Wabanaki diplomacy, as expressed through our confederacy and a host of other cultural norms and protocols, is a centuries-old form of multicultural, multinational relations. It's in our wampum belt traditions. It's in some ways it was formalized as a confederacy per se during the early frames of colonization, but it has existed for many for hundreds of years even before that. In the point number 2, basically the confederacy is an adaptable, these are scholars writing about it, it's an adaptable kind of process of responding to outsiders, facing threats. It also employs notions of persuasive discourse, like other forms of indigenous diplomacy. So having a clear and fine mind, and there are all sorts of metaphors that are engaged when we talk about folks engaging in forms of Wabanaki diplomacy. An important frame, and this is kind of a frame of radical democracy, but I think it has a particular protocol and framework in our diplomatic traditions through our confederacy. In the Passamaquoddy language, this notion, Dagwin Dole Westu, everyone talks, or everyone has a chance at the table to persuade. This notion has become really important in terms of building consensus and including as many voices as possible in our research. So just, you know, real quickly in terms of some of the findings, of course, you know, the increase in winter ticks and the loss of moose has been studied, and hopefully people know that story. Basically, moose are getting attacked and are being killed by thousands and thousands of ticks that no longer die off during the winter because it is not cold enough to kill them off. We also see, in terms of these threats, increased water temperature that leading to impacting fish and forest practices, increase in air temperature leading to other invasive species, and again, sort of the forest practice. Again, the part of this resilience in terms of where do we look for answers as Wabanaki people for adapting to changing climates this has been really a matter of people reinvesting in native language and stories, that our resilience is based upon our ability to mobilize our own knowledge traditions through our language and stories, and really support ourselves through various forms of food sovereignty and connections to food, anything from sea mammals to, this issue around moose and ticks, but the broader set of access points for Wabanaki food sovereignty and mobilization is going to be critical to our adaptation. We've also talked about the political and cultural frameworks that exist across national boundaries as a call for political and cultural action that will not only just mobilize people in the state of Maine, but more broadly across northern New England and eastern Canada. That Indigenous leadership around the world is really the primary leadership for climate adaptation and climate justice. And we see that in various forums at the COPs, the Conference of Parties with the international relations at the UN, and in so many situations across the planet. Again, listening to clan mothers, strengthening our family and clan identities, working to protect cultural sites threatened by sea level rise and erosion, because much like our historian friend said, the history, our history is written in these sites along the coast through various forms of petroglyphs and other things that our ancestors left behind for us to understand and really use in this international space and mobilize around the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and to articulate our action across the region more broadly. And then, I can't remember if this is the last slide or not. Our sort of needs, these are all in progress, sort of, and this is resonant with some of the other presenters. More education in the community around climate-related topics for our leadership, more hands-on projects involve children, and mobilize community knowledge through various forms of integrated community planning. Tribal governments, just like other governments in the modern world, are siloed in ways that don't lend towards integrated climate planning. And there's been a real call recently within the tribes to make sure that climate is a critical piece uniting all sorts of planning in terms of things like transportation, social services, obviously health, emergency response, wildlife. Okay, good. Conclusions, that's probably the last slide then. Yeah, I mean, really, other parts of our research is showing that, climate adaptation and climate justice work without Indigenous leadership is probably at a loss. That there's more and more scholarship emerging that Indigenous leadership in things like climate adaptation and biodiversity protection is the critical sort of spice to making this sustainable. Parts of what I want to emphasize around thinking through Indigenous frameworks means to rethink the context of where our place of action is, as well as how we engage, and really thinking through. And I thought the Amazon is also a great example of this, right? Where it's not bound by a particular nation state. And if you think about it through Indigenous nations, it's framed up in an interconnection and complicated web, and really thinking about climate adaptation planning and linking it to Indigenous people and places and processes is a critical part of what I would say is climate justice in the next 30 to 50 years. So I'll end there. Thank you.
So at this time, I'd like to thank the panelists for what they've said so far, and now we're going to open up for questions and discussions. Feel free to focus it on one panelist, certain, like all of them, or even just the audience. So if anyone has any comments, questions.
All right, so this one's kind of for Dr. Courtney. And one of the issues I see is climate change becoming a political avenue in a negative way. So it's becoming very polarized. It's leaning towards the Democratic Party. And obviously, as Reverend Yearwood discussed, this is a human crisis. So how do you see us like moving forward and trying to make that less polarized? I know that's a heavy question, but.
Thank you. It's a great question. I was struck by Reverend Yearwood's commentary on this line. I thought it was a really insightful thing for him to say that, paraphrasing, he didn't put it quite like this. In a way, nature is going to do that for us. That is, it's going to be increasingly difficult to deny the realities of climate change as it gets more severe. However, we would all prefer not to wait quite that long. And he emphasized this as well. You know, it's difficult to say beyond the sort of usual talking points of we have to improve education, we have to expose people to a meaningful understanding of the natural processes and what's actually happening earlier. Yeah, I don't know if there's much more than that that can be done, you know, in a very sort of pragmatic way. The only other thing is, you mentioned polarization. There has to be genuine engagement from both sides to sort of break down the polarization. It's not going to be pretty. We're all going to end up making sacrifices that we do not like, but to some degree, to preserve, you know, any sort of political functionality, there's going to have to be a certain spirit of compromise. The book that I'm touting all the time is Ziblatt and Levitsky's How Democracies Die. How do they die? Nobody gives, right? Everybody sticks to their positions until the center will no longer hold. And so finding that sort of anchor point where important issues are addressed, but also being able to compromise is the threading of the needle, I think.
Any more comments or questions? Oh, you're right there. I was looking behind you.
Hi, yeah, this is just kind of like everyone, if anyone wants to jump in and answer, but specifically like from a political history and science perspective, it all overlaps in the fact that you said that it's going to be undeniable for when climate changes, like when it's here and it's like, and you can't deny it anymore. Well, there's huge amounts of the population that you can't deny it anymore because it's already affected them and it will continue to affect them disproportionately, like you guys talked about. So how do you think there's going to be that turning point for when the people that can't afford to not live on the oceans or live in pristine areas can actually like wake up and see the fact that there's huge swaths of climate migration and devastation that happens in our own country, which is like the richest in the world, that even the Reverend Lennox talked about. So I just didn't know if you guys had opinions on that.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I think that it's gonna have to be that more people are gonna start to be affected before we can get anything done with the trends that are continuing right now. I mean, we can try to you know, rally. I think a lot of the people around our age are trying to get stuff done, but until more populations are affected or we increase education of what's actually going on, it's kind of pessimistic to say, but there's not much changing right now. We're seeing like a lot of stuff going through about like, you know, in 2035, we'll have like, you know, net zero emissions for companies. But, you know, we're already, like science has told us we're already past that tipping point. And the stuff that's going to happen for climate change is going to happen. We've already have too much heat in our system, in our Earth system. So I don't have really a more optimistic answer. I don't know if anyone else does.
I'd like to be more pessimistic still, actually. So I think you're exactly right. I think the observation that you know, the damage is occurring, that it's affecting people's lives in dramatic ways currently. And so here's the pessimistic with a, I meant for this to be a short comment. Here's the pessimistic comment with a positive potential spin. In 2014, who knows how good the polling is, but they held a popular poll in Russia on a number of dead leaders. Joseph Stalin had a 56% approval rating in 2014. Joseph Stalin, 2014, a 56. That's better than most of our presidents in this country ever achieved, yeah? And what this speaks to, right, is what are facts? What history are they reading? Right, it's obviously a monopolized media. There's also the whole thing. but you point to a very real and frightening problem, which is the scientific realities, the political truths, all of these things are only as good as the mechanisms through which they're delivered. So this is a very serious thing about a free press and an engaged readership. And
Yeah, I have something to say that's so slightly more optimistic. Okay. Thank you. So just a couple of factoids, that sort of things we know from research. There's this notion that, you know, if 3.5% of the population engage in active protesting around a particular issue, that actually has almost never failed to transform society in the last couple hundred years. So I'm not saying we're there yet or anything like that. I just want to put that out there. The other statistic I want to point out is that because of indigenous and other pipeline resistors and climate activists, there are currently somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of the total greenhouse gas emissions that are being delayed because of pipeline and other forms of political resistance just in North America. Okay, so this is a recent study, came out about a year and a half, about a year ago. Which is to say that, and that's with effort of, like, you know, a pretty small band of very dedicated climate warriors and water protectors, led mostly by indigenous people. So I'll just kind of, those are, for what it's worth, you know, I think those are hopeful kinds of forms of tipping point where it's not about convincing, you know, your drunk uncle at Thanksgiving who thinks that there's some sort of plot against him and white men or something, but it is about mobilizing probably a younger population to be very actively engaged and out in the streets in, you know, in active participation and showing through feet and force their commitment to these issues. So I hate being a 50-year-old optimist. There's nothing more boring than that. I cut my long hair a long time ago. So this is just things to think about.
Excellent. All right, I'll jump in here. My first is the response to you know, the issue of how do we deal with this domestically, politically. It's a global issue, but it can only be addressed domestic. Every nation state has domestic laws, and so we can get into a conference and make a bunch of agreements at the, you know, accords, and then go back to Congress and they won't vote for any of those, right? The one fallacy I would like to address is that this is a Democrat-Republican issue. You know, it was a Republican, Joe Manchin, who was in bed with the coal industry. I mean, he loves the coal industry more than I love cookies. Guy loves the coal industry. And so the idea that this is a Democrat or Republican issue, I don't think is it is a capitalism issue. And that's what I'm trying to get at with colonialism, is that there is a certain logic that arrives with the introduction of capitalism that emphasizes individuality, that atomizes communities, in other words, separates communities, that privatizes land, and that logic is the logic of every economic, is the dominant logic of the economic system for the last 400 years. And so what we need is indigenous ways of thinking, indigenous ways of knowing. In the modern era, that's called socialism. Unfortunately, many socialists don't work with indigenous people. They're in the city, they're in New York, or in Boston, or in LA, right? And so that's, I mean, I really like that we have the presentation on the Wabanaki, because their entire way of thinking about the environment, the indigenous way of thinking about the environment is about sustainability, right? And it goes directly against all of the interest in Congress. And so that's why we have people outside of Congress, the Sunrise Movement, that are protesting. Now, my recommendation to young people is to go and find out how you can hook up and support the Wabanaki people, the indigenous people, wherever you are. Black Lives Matters, right? Which are politicizing issues, and then you can create alliances, right? And that's what needs to happen. Is we need these different movements to ally together, and to then put political pressure on people. Though that's where, I mean, and it's a long roll, but the idea that either party is interested, I don't see either party being particularly interested in what the indigenous people care about. I mean, if you look at the Sunrise Movement, who have they reached out to? The socialists. right? Bernie Sanders and AOC, because they're thinking in terms of the social.
Okay, so this is for Dr. Ranco, actually. So you mentioned the importance of like the voice of Indigenous people. Are there any organizations or groups now that are actively including them in discussions?
Actively involved in what discussion? Sorry.
Yes, exactly. Shutting down pipelines or
Sure.
things like that. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, no. So there is Indigenous leadership all over the world, and some of this, and I just want to reference also some of this in Central and South America are some of the places where we're actually documenting Indigenous leaders who are being basically kidnapped and killed, probably backed by corporate entities around the world. But there are different forms of leadership. You can look at, say, the grassroots movement around Standing Rock. Someone mentioned that. That was, an intersectional movement, right? Very purposely. Black Lives Matter was there. Veterans were there. Various forms of other groups under the guise and leadership of Indigenous people. Most of the pipeline movements in US and Canada right now are either co-run or primarily run by Indigenous activists. Look at Sacred Earth Project, Winona LaDuke, all of these sort of activist frameworks. Indigenous Environmental Network was a critical part of the frames of the Standing Rock and subsequent pipeline activism. So I would say, just looking at these organizations, are these big percentages of major political parties? No, but I will say this, for the very first time, and these are hopeful things, we have an Indigenous person at the head of the Department of Interior in the United States, and we have an Indigenous person running the national park system for the first time in the history of the United States. I'm not saying just their presence alone transforms this obscene and violent capitalist structure that I think we all know is leading to various forms of exploitation and destruction. I will just say that those are, in my opinion, the lights with which we can kind of mark and say, let's build upon those. Again, the resistance to pipelines, the resistance to fossil fuel developments, and the very central role around the globe Indigenous people have in these movements.
Yeah. We're just going to quickly take one last question.
Both for Dr. Ranco and Allegre, just thinking about how horrendous the doctrine of discovery has been toward the lives of Indigenous people all over the world. And I know there's a group protesting right with the Pope as we speak. And I'm wondering how important you think that movement is to get Pope Francis to rescind the doctrine of.
You want me to go? Sorry, this is awkward. I think it's a these are important fights, because the basis of our very basis of what property is, in settler societies is built upon this, racist, white supremacist, Christian supremacist system that only certain Christian kings can actually own and transfer property and that sort of thing. So, of course, that was the basis of various forms of exploitation and during the colonial framework, and that we're still dealing with this legacy today. I think to the extent that leads to the kinds of transformations and rethinking of the sort of colonial extractivism that motivates most of capitalism, to the extent that we can see a one-to-one relationship between the doctrine of discovery and that, and people mobilize that into these intersectional movements around climate justice, I think it's probably not as, I'm about results. That's why I always quote these studies. So, I really think that, tying it to then the broader movement and sort of its mobilization, but getting people who don't understand or are previously unaware of how this doctrine has shaped the entire property system and makeup of the Western Hemisphere, I think helps in terms of our cause around education, probably more so than anything.
Thank you. What I'll say is, I mean, it's all of these movements now, all of these social justice movements, wherever you look at, they're all employing historical narratives. And in fact, the Reverend talked about his work is the work of storytelling, right? Of using narratives to shape the conversation, to shape the arguments. And so I feel as far as the rejection of the doctrine goes, it's very useful for us in forming our own narratives within our own groups. Forget about the actual movement as a whole, but if I get together with a bunch of people, we're gonna assess, say, the environmental catastrophe, and we're gonna talk about the origins. And the origins are historical. And so as a history professor, of course, one thing that I'm constantly trying to emphasize is that all of these movements are making historical arguments, right? And in fact, when you go into a court case, when a tribal leader goes into a court case, suing a corporation or the like, they're making historical arguments about land and about who resides in that land and who has the right. So for me, it is, it's not earth-shattering because the results are what matter, as the doctor said, but it is important for me also as an activist saying this is something that we can use to create our narratives about, and to create our arguments.
Okay, please join me in thanking our panelists for this evening.